Welcome everyone to Red Planet Live. I am your host, Ashton Zeth. I am elated to be hosting the Mars Society's podcast and leading the conversation about human exploration of the universe and the future settlement of Mars. As a longtime space enthusiast, I am passionate about STEM education and making humanity an interplanetary species. So thank you everybody for joining, for supporting Red Planet Live. Happy to have you here today. Before I introduce today's guest speaker, just want to remind everyone, as you know, we've talked about it, the 27th annual International Mars Society Conference is coming up and scheduled August 8th through the 11th at the University of Washington here in Seattle. Now, this 4-day event will bring together leading scientists, policymakers, commercial space executives, government representatives, media, space enthusiasts, everybody. We're going to be at the conference discussing the pressing topics related to space exploration, technology advances, and planning for the human exploration and settlement of Mars. If you're getting the emails, you've seen some of the speakers who are going to be there, and the list is stacked. So I hope to see you there. The Mars Society will be again offering both in-person and virtual attendance. So attendees from around the world can join the conference, pose questions, interact with each other. Again, I hope to see you there. More details can be found online at www.marssociety.org. Okay, let's get to the fun stuff. So for today, we have a special guest. Want to introduce Dr. Michaela Musilova, who is an accomplished astrobiologist, analog astronaut, speaker, author. She has conducted space-related research at prestigious institutions worldwide, including Caltech, University College London, and Sheba University. She has also collaborated with NASA, ESA, various international observatories, and has significantly contributed to our understanding of space. She has also served as a crew member at MDRS, Crew 134 in 2014, and commander of Crew 173 in 2016, both at MDRS. So excited to have a familiar face. And lastly, wanted to mention that she is currently leading the Astro 7 Summits project. She's combining educational outreach with scientific research, scaling the tallest mountains on each continent to highlight climate change. Michaela has also served as the director of HISES, commanding over 30 simulated Moon and Mars missions. And she's also a visiting professor at the Slovak University of Technology and a key figure at Neutronix, which she continues to inspire and educate audiences globally. Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you very much for the very kind intro.
We keep going on and on. I hope I didn't miss anything there. There was a lot to that bio, so we've got a lot to chat about today. So thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Happy to be here.
Well, as usual, we're going to kick off the conversation today with our segment called Question of the Day. Again, no right or wrong answers. It's just an icebreaker. But I would love to know, Michaela, do you have a hidden talent?
I guess, yeah, it comes kind of relevant today because I just came here to join the podcast from 2 hours of singing. I'm part of a School of Rock band in DC where I'm based. I actually only started singing recently, but it's something I've enjoyed doing my whole life. And I'm so glad that I get to have this hobby now. And another hidden talent is dancing. I love dancing. I've been doing that my whole life, tried all sorts of things. And yeah, it's just a passion I want to continue pursuing while doing all my other fun activities.
So you said this was something you started a little bit later in life. Was it just a hidden talent? You never knew that you had a singing ability, or you've always loved to sing and you're like, no, I could make this a thing?
So I've always loved to sing, and actually I got quote unquote discovered when I was a kid. I was in a scout camp. I was maybe 7-8 years old, and at the time, I think the Titanic movie came out. It was plus minus around that time in my life. And I was just singing My Heart Will Go On. And I was, a little kid, and I was able to hit all the notes. And people were like, wow, I can't believe you do that. But for some reason, I never pursued it as a class or hobby to take after school or anything like that. So unfortunately, I never was able to get better at it. And now finally I'm in a stage in my life where like, I want to pursue my hobbies finally, more than I ever did before. Because before it was something that I kind of sacrificed in order to spend more time working or doing other activities. So now I decided to go for it. I definitely don't have that range anymore. I don't think I can do Celine Dion anymore, but I'll try my best. Today it was what's it called? Nothing Else Matters by Metallica. That was really the thing that kind of made me work hard.
Well, that's perfect. I forgot to tell you, we have a segment that we sing on the podcast.
Oh,
and
no.
I wouldn't put you on the spot like that.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Still have me beat by a long shot, but I won't make you sing today. But I am excited to chat with you. We've obviously got some time to connect here today, and I've got lots of questions to get through. So as we're going through conversation and questions, I want to remind everybody, if you have questions, please put those in the chat and we will sprinkle those throughout the conversation. So I think usually the best place to start is at the beginning. So obviously you're well accomplished. You've been an analog astronaut for quite some time now. I'm curious, have you always been interested in space? Is this something you discovered later in life, like singing, or you've always, since childhood wanted to explore the universe?
So unlike singing, I actually did decide to pursue this from childhood. I discovered it kind of by accident. When I was a kid, my parents would take my brother and I into the nature a lot, and I just became very curious, wanted to know more. And I first fell in love with volcanoes when I was about 7 years old. And a year later, I was bored while my parents were shopping, and I was just browsing through a book, an encyclopedia or something. And I came across a chapter about Saturn and Jupiter and how they have moons, and there could potentially be life on those moons. And that instantly started this spark in me where I wanted to know more, and I wanted to look for aliens myself. So since then, I always knew I wanted to be an astrobiologist, but it's more how to become one that was a challenge. Because as someone from Slovakia, there are very few opportunities in the space sector, and I knew I had to study abroad. And that kind of started a pretty challenging journey of having to save as much money as possible, have multiple part-time jobs, even in my high school years, try to get the best possible grades to get scholarships. And only then I was able to get into universities in the UK and in the US, for example, Caltech. But it was always this like endless grind of trying to get as many scholarships as possible, have multiple part-time jobs. And that's why, for example, I had to sacrifice hobbies like singing so that I could pursue my studies. But it paid off because already at age of 21, I was able to work at NASA JPL on a research grant. And that's when I finally got my foot in the door of astrobiology. And it's just been something I've been pursuing since then. However, the astronaut dream, that's kind of been like on and off. It also started when I was young, probably around the age of 8 when I discovered that I enjoyed aliens. I also, there's a picture of me around that age. I think at NASA Goddard, I was able to try on this makeshift spacesuit. And since then, I've been dreaming about it, but it always seemed like such an impossible dream. And again, for someone from my part of the world, there are just very few opportunities to go to space. So I decided to pursue that against all odds. And I'll try my best. But if it doesn't work out, I hope that at least with the work that I do, I'll open doors to other people from my country so that someone else may be able to go if I'm not able to in the end.
Yeah, still contributing to the overall effort and getting humans out into space. Well, I think we're good luck. There was an announcement today. A friend of the podcast, Emily Calandrelli, did announce today that she's going to space with Blue Origin. So she's the second astronaut now that I've interviewed in the last year and a half. The other is Dr. Shana Pandya, who have both announced that they are going on missions to space. So this might be good luck. I think we're going to send you a good
crossed.
Yeah, you're going to be the third on that list. So we'll be thinking about it for sure. Well, one of the things that I mentioned, you've got this dream, you want to go to space. In the bio, I mentioned that you previously served as director of HI-SEAS. Can you tell us what does that stand for? What was your role while you were there? What's the purpose of HI-SEAS?
Mm-hmm. So HI-SEAS is a research facility in Hawaii, similar to MDRS. So it's a place where we conducted simulated missions to the moon and Mars. I don't know if MDRS only focuses on Mars, but HI-SEAS, we do also lunar analog missions. And I actually first went to high seas because I was meant to be part of an 8-month NASA-funded mission. And unfortunately, because of an injury in the crew, I wasn't able to complete that mission fully. The mission was basically stopped prematurely. But the silver lining was that the owner of the facility really liked my ideas for doing lunar analog missions and some other type of research. And I actually got offered the job of being the director of high seas and decided to stay and pursue that. And yeah, during my time, I organized over 40 of these analog missions, and I myself ended up being the commander of over 30. It was not my original plan, but the pandemic kind of led to that, where we didn't have time to train the crews before they were able to start their mission, which is what we would typically do. Depending on the length of the mission, you give crews training for several days or several weeks, so that they're prepared to be autonomous during the mission. But during the pandemic, basically everyone arrived at the airport, and I would pick them up in our quote unquote space shuttle / van that took us up on the volcano where the high seas station is based in Hawaii. And we basically started our mission there, and I was training them in a mission. And that's one of the reasons why I ended up being the commander of so many missions, and essentially lived up there for over a year with all those missions. And so like MDRS at high seas, we simulate what the first missions are likely to look like when humans will go to the moon and Mars. So where you live with a limited supply of food, water, and other resources, and you have to make do with what you are given. You can only go outside in a spacesuit with permission from mission control. And even to do that, you have to ask for permission the day before. Mission control, we actually had a facility on the big island of Hawaii, so the same island that high seas is based on, to conduct the mission support type operations, kind of the equivalent of NASA Houston, but of course, very minimal version of that. And what's great about high seas is that the volcanic terrain around the facility, because it's on a volcano at approximately 8,200 feet, we know that some parts of the moon and Mars have similar geology, so we could conduct a lot of relevant geological research. It also has lava tubes that are created during eruptions, and what they are basically these long lava tunnels. And inside them, there's all sorts of microbial growth. So that was very interesting for someone like me, an astrobiologist, because we think that there are lava tubes on Mars as well. And if we find any life on Mars, it'll likely be in these kinds of underground environments. So I end up conducting a lot of astrobiology work in collaboration with NASA during my missions there. So it's kind of like living both my dreams, both doing the astrobiology and the analog astronaut stuff. And both of those were bringing me closer to my childhood dreams.
Oh, I love that. You served a lot of missions. I'm curious to hear, your perspective. Somebody like myself, I aspire to go on an analog mission, but sometimes I wonder if I'm qualified to participate, because I'm not a scientist. I'm not an engineer. What would you say to someone who is like me, doesn't have that technical degree, but wants to participate in an analog mission?
I think it's really important to remain open-minded and give everyone a possibility to take part in missions. So people like you would be very much welcome. But of course, it depends on the facility and what their rules are. When I was the director of high seas, it was my goal to make the facility and the missions as accessible as possible, because I found that the more diverse the crew was, the more successful the missions were. And that's for many reasons. And I mean diversity, not just in terms of nationality, race, other factors that diversify human crews, but also in terms of the skill set. Many times in the past, analog missions would have mostly scientists, engineers, doctors, and while everyone was, very skilled and experts in what they know, when some kind of problem arose, not everyone was able to think out of the box and come up with some new solution. They were kind of, trained to think a certain way. And so if everyone kind of thinks in a similar way, it's really hard to solve some problems. Whereas when you have people that are different in the crew, who had a different type of training or just a different perspective on life, they can really help solve a number of issues. But also the diversity really helped in us bonding better. When the crew members are different from one another, we always have something to learn, so we can open our minds to different ideas and things. And so I found that the very diverse crews I had were just getting along better for the most part, and we became something closer to a space family of sorts than just a group of professionals trying to survive an analog mission together for some period of time. So I just made it a rule that every time I recruited crews, I made sure there was at least one crew member that was different from the rest in terms of their skill set. And I had teachers, artists, journalists, you name it, all sorts of diverse people on the crews. And it was always a great addition. And I was very grateful for their presence. So I highly encourage you and others who might be hesitating to apply and see, how it goes. There are some facilities that are made more for quote unquote beginner analog astronauts, people who don't have much experience in that area, but are willing to try, or they can find a role that could work for them. I think you and I talked about how potentially someone like you could take on the role of being like the crew journalist or in charge of maybe social media and things that you're familiar with. But there's so many ways a crew member can contribute to a mission and help make it be successful. So I definitely encourage everyone to give it a try. You never know until you give it a shot. And I'm sure for most people, it can be a really life-changing experience.
Absolutely. Okay, good. Well, I'm glad to know there's hope for myself. That's something I would like to do as well. So, well, what about those that may have disabilities or have some physical challenges? Is there potential opportunities for other individuals to participate in analog missions as well?
Yeah, so fortunately, things are changing for the better in that respect as well. A lot of facilities are trying to become more accessible to people with disabilities. And actually, there have been a number of studies that have been conducted in recent years to make quote unquote para-astronauts be able to be part of these missions. And actually, I was the commander of such a mission last year. We had a para-astronaut on the crew. It was a crew member that had a lifelong issue with their leg. But despite that, they were able to be an amazing crew member. Their disability played no role in the mission at all whatsoever. If anything, I think because most of their life they had to be resourceful to deal with their disability, they were just always full of ideas and also very open-minded, very positive. So they were just a wonderful crew member, and we didn't even really notice that they had any disability. And I think that's something we need to work with some more, is that many times there's prejudice or too much worry, like, oh, how could we accommodate someone with a disability? But actually, in many cases, their presence might not even make things much more different than they would be during a normal mission. Yes, you might have to tweak some things, and maybe the crew needs some more briefing to be able to help that person. But many times they can actually be a wonderful addition. And now I know that some facilities have even had wheelchair users as analog astronauts. So it's really changing for the better in this way. I'm very grateful for that. And I hope there'll be more projects like the one I was part of to make it, make analog missions be even more diverse in that respect.
That's so wonderful to hear. I'm really glad to hear that there are more opportunities for individuals, even if it's, not a disability or a physical challenge, but those that come from diverse backgrounds, that there is an opportunity for everybody that wants to participate and make a difference within, analog missions, but also space exploration as a whole.
And maybe I'll just add briefly that, I think a lot of these people that have some disability, can be really talented different things. And it's really a shame that just because of something physical, they wouldn't be able to fully use their abilities in such environments. And on future space missions, we might really need such people with those talents. So again, it's really important to find ways to make space as accessible to them as possible. And I say some people also argue that it's important to do these types of missions also in preparation for there potentially something bad happening in space, where people may not have certain disabilities, and then there will be some kind of injury and someone will have a new disability that they weren't prepared for. So that's also, I would say, a pragmatic way of looking at the situation. But for me personally, it's the diversifying of analog astronauts that I find to be a very important part of this project.
Absolutely agree with you. I recall reading an article on NASA's website about some of the technologies and the innovations that had come from the space industry. And there's a few that we all know about, like iPhones and GPS and very small, powerful cameras. But another one that I was intrigued by was prosthetic limbs. That the technology for modern day prosthetic limbs came from the space industry, and those innovative technologies are impacting the everyday lives of humans now. And so I think that, again, you're going to need those that have diverse backgrounds, that have different physical challenges as well, because that's going to be able to enhance the type of experience. It's going to help to with the development of those technologies. So really, like you said, opportunity for everybody that wants to participate. We're going to see a lot of good come from that.
Yeah, definitely agree.
Well, thinking of, again, analog astronaut missions, I know that recently the 2024 Analog Astronaut Conference was held at Biosphere 2 in Arizona, which brought together analog astronauts from around the world to connect, collaborate, discuss research, and build relationships within the community. And I saw that there were a ton of familiar faces, including yourself. Executive Director for the Mars Society, James Burke, was there. Dr. Shauna Pandya, who I mentioned before, Dr. Graham Lau, who's been on the podcast, Terry Trevino, quite a few, just to name a couple that we're familiar with. But tell us about the conference. Was there something that was really cool or interesting that you got to learn that you can share with us?
What I really enjoy about that conference is that everyone is so passionate about the analog astronaut world, and that means everything from the science that we do. Essentially, all of us have this dream of becoming astronauts, so we really bond over that.
Yeah.
But also, so many people are able to think out of the box, and so I always just enjoy going to the presentations. And I'm always surprised by all these new ideas of that research that can be conducted, or actually research that has been conducted, and amazing new results. But at the conference, you also see people that show, for example, space fashion. And one person that I was really impressed with is a designer who has been creating kind of flight suits, but for women, because to this day, most of this type of clothing is made for men. It's just, I guess, for historical reasons and others. And so the flight suits, for example, make it really difficult for women to be able to go to the bathroom and things like that. And these suits are actually made specifically to make this much easier for women. And I just love that idea. And honestly, I wish I had access to something like that during my many missions in the past. And we saw kind of a shortage of these things during my missions, when a lot of the suits that we were preparing for the analog astronauts, I could only get them in male sizes. And the gloves as well, they're all huge, and as a smaller woman, I have small hands, and all the gloves were ginormous, and it's really hard to be able to do any work with that. So even things like this, I feel, are very inspirational and can help make great changes in the space sector and make it more accessible again, especially to people who are not maybe your typical military types that the original suits and things like that were tailored for.
Right. Not the traditional military test pilot kind of statuette there. Do you think that the conference is an opportunity for those that want to get involved in analog missions? Like maybe they're new, they're interested in attending. Would this be a good opportunity for them to join, to learn, meet with other analog astronauts?
Yes, definitely. I would say a good part, maybe 50% or more of the people there were actually new to the analog astronaut community, and they came there exactly for those reasons, to see if it's something that would work for them, what the different opportunities are, to meet people, ask for their opinions and experiences. Many directors, like you mentioned, of some of the facilities tend to come to the conference so they can talk to them directly about what the conditions are like, what the application process is like, if they might like their research ideas, things like that. So it's very useful from that perspective. And it's just a great networking event for a lot of us in the space sector who are in this analog astronaut world. And that means people who have space aspirations as astronauts, and or people who are trying to test technologies here on Earth or research projects in order to prepare humans to be able to actually perform them on the Moon and Mars. That's another really important component of the analog astronaut world, is that we're really trying to make sure that we will be ready to go back to the moon and finally to Mars. But to do that, we have to test things so many times here on Earth first, and that includes testing us humans. We're still trying to figure out, what are the best types of people to send on long duration missions, what are the typical problems that arise during these missions, how to deal with those problems or preempt them if at all possible.
Yeah. There's a lot to be learned there. And the Biosphere 2 location to host this conference seems so fitting. For those that are unfamiliar, can you talk a little bit about like what is Biosphere 2 and why would the conference be held at that specific location?
Mm-hmm. I can't say I'm like super well versed in this, but from what I know, it's a facility.
Tri-Stats and at the SAM as well. So there's that, as you guys were on a crew together before.
That's right. Yeah. So in terms of Biosphere 2, from what I remember, I think it was built in the 80s or something like that by actually a group of enthusiasts who wanted to create a facility actually in a way in preparation for humans to be able to go to other planets. But they built it in a way like Noah's Ark, where it is made of different environments representing different biomes on our planet. And they also, like kind of for Noah's Ark, had different types of animals assembled to represent Earth as best as possible. And it's a really huge facility where they even have these two structures called the lungs, which help deal with all the air that changes throughout the facility during the day and night. So during the day it would expand and these huge lungs would lift, I think it was like 20 tons of cement up into the air. And then as the air cools at night, it contracts. And so these huge lungs again kind of put down the huge cement they were lifting up earlier. And so it's a very complex, amazing system that was built both to see whether humans could live in there for long periods of time. So I think if I remember correctly, the first crew was there for about 2 years. The second mission, I think, was cut short, so they weren't there for such a long period. But they were trying to live there in a self-sustainable way, growing food and maintaining these different biomes and being as cut off from the rest of the world as possible. So it was, in a way, one of, if not the first analog mission of sorts. But for various reasons, because it was, I think, a private operation and there were some internal issues and probably lacking funding and other things, it unfortunately didn't continue after the early 90s. I think that's when the first two missions took place. And since then, it was owned by a couple of different universities, I think Columbia and University of Arizona. And so now it's being run by the University of Arizona. And while there aren't any simulated missions of sorts happening in the facility, they're doing a number of research, making the most of these amazing different biomes they created. So there's like a desert environment, an ocean, a rainforest, savanna, and I think one or two more. So that's a really impressive facility to visit. And in a way, it is kind of like an analog environment. So I'm sure that also inspired the reason for why the Analog Astronaut Conference is there. But the other reason, as you mentioned, is they're building a new facility, or it's essentially almost finished at this point, called SAM. And it's also like a simulated, a research station for simulated missions to the Moon and Mars, I think, for both. And they've been building it the last few years. And I think they already did about 3 missions at this point, but they're still adding more things. Recently, they added a whole simulated Mars yard for their research projects. So that one is kind of up and coming. And I think what's particularly interesting about that one is that they're able to like fully seal it. So there's even like a pressure difference, and they have to go through a full airlock before they can enter and exit the facility. And their analog spacesuits are pressurized. So that's kind of adding another higher fidelity level to the simulated missions that exist around the world. And as you mentioned, so Kai Stotz is, I think, currently the director of the SAM facility. And he and I did our very first simulated mission back in 2014. So it was the first time for both of us, and it was at MDRS. So we have known each other since then, and it's interesting how we both ended up kind of going even deeper into this analog astronaut world, and both were directors of a facility similar to MDRS.
It's incredible to see, how small and close knit the analog astronaut community is. I mean, you can serve with somebody, and years later, you're both director of facilities and continuing in this research. But you've served on 2 missions at MDRS. Obviously, the one in 2014, that was Crew 134, and another you were commander for Crew 173. You can talk about your experience at MDRS, and were there major differences between your first mission and your second, obviously besides being commander?
Yes, I think the first time, for someone who's always dreamed of being an astronaut, it was like living my dream. It was incredible for me, because I was doing both astrobiology research as part of my work during the mission. And to do that, I would put on an analog spacesuit, go into this amazing terrain. For those of you, that's actually from that exact mission, me doing some geology and astrobiology research. And you can see even that picture, like the environment around MDRS really looks like you're on the red planet. It's really beautiful and very interesting from a geology perspective and also from an astrobiology perspective. So for me to be able to go out there, do my research while wearing the suit, literally felt like I was dreaming, that I'm actually on Mars doing something I always wanted to do my entire life. So it was very fulfilling for me, very enriching, also because I learned a lot as being part of a crew. What's important in terms of team dynamics, for example. In the past, but at that point, so I was doing my PhD, I think, when I was part of this mission. And before this mission, I had taken part in different expeditions to extreme environments, for example, in Greenland, to pursue my astrobiology research. And there, for example, I was looking at what life can survive in the extreme environments in Greenland and what we can learn from that when looking for life elsewhere. But part of my research was also related to climate change. But when I was part of these expeditions and also other projects where many times I was the only woman on the team, some of my skills, actually, my other team members made me feel like there was something bad rather than something good. For example, I'm a very empathetic person, and I think empathy is extremely important when working in teams. But when I was part of these male-dominated teams under certain circumstances, I was teased for being empathetic and for being too sensitive, and that I should actually, grow a thick skin and just tease everybody and be kind of meaner like they were. And so for a long time, I actually almost started to believe that that's how you're supposed to be, toughen up and all that kind of thing. And that my empathetic skills were actually a weakness. And it wasn't until that first analog Mars mission that I realized that no, actually empathy is a very important skill, and actually is one of the things that has helped me be the commander of so many missions, because I always try and understand what the other people are going through, how they're feeling. Does someone need some time off or help? Or on the contrary, is everyone really happy and we can make the most of this time and do some other activities together as a crew? And so during that particular mission, there were some situations where a mediator was needed or someone empathetic to help deal with certain problems. And at first I hesitated whether to step in because of a certain societal conditioning of sorts that I went through before that. But I decided to, listen to my heart, and I felt like that was the right thing to do at the time. And I think it really helped in some of those situations, and it made me kind of believe in myself more. So that mission was very eye-opening to me from that respect as well. And then when I came back as a commander, I already knew that I should use my empathy, that's an important thing to do. And now I kind of had learned my lesson.
Yeah, it's not a weakness.
Exactly. But then, for example, I had to learn to find the balance of, how to still have the respect from the crew while still being friendly with them. And so I also that was a great learning experience for me to kind of figure that out. And again, I was kind of conditioned to think that as a leader, you kind of need to have a, step away from the rest of the crew. You need to be at a different level or whatever my previous professors and supervisors kind of made me think that that's the right thing to do. And during that mission, again, I realized, nope, just listen to my gut, do what feels right. And that ended up working so much better. So they were both very important experiences for me, and they set me up not only to be able to lead many more missions in the future, but also in different work environments around the world. For example, at the time when I was leading the Mission 173 at MDRS, I was the chair of the Slovak Organization for Space Activities in Slovakia, or SOSA for short. And we planned on launching the first Slovak satellite to space that very year. It was a big effort to try and show that Slovakia has potential to succeed in the space sector and that we can actually develop technologies in Slovakia. And we don't have to just everyone move abroad to be able to pursue these space streams. That was one of my big goals. And that's actually why I came back to Slovakia after my PhD. And after this mission in 2017, I just kind of figured out what works for me as a leader. And then I helped lead my team to successfully launch that satellite later that year. And I also started teaching astrobiology for the first time in Slovakia. And I started my first space technology company in Slovakia as well. So it really helped me in different ways, not just in the analog astronaut world.
Yeah, it's a skill that you can apply to any other role or relationships that you have in various projects. But I have to ask, I mean, you're a veteran analog astronaut. Does like the out of body experience when you're in your suit and you step outside the hab and you're looking at that landscape, on that 30th time where you commanded that mission, like, does the awe ever wear off, or do you still feel like, no, I could be on another planet like Mars right now?
I think I'm a very pragmatic person. So for me, it did wear off just because I was just kind of like, oh, now you're the commander. You need to focus on, the crew being happy and all these tasks need to get done, So I kind of didn't let myself enjoy the moment as much as I used to. However, I saw the awe in all my crew members, especially those for whom it was the first time. And they reminded me of it. And then I kind of was immersed in their awe. So that's how I was able to kind of relive it myself and kind of put some of the bureaucracy to one side and like truly enjoy the moment with them, because I didn't want to take away anything from them. And their joy and happiness just rubbed off on me. And so we all kind of got to enjoy those moments together.
Well, it sounds like you're still finding some of those awe moments with another project that you're currently working on, the Astro 7 Summits. For those that don't know what this is, can you tell us about this project?
So about 3 years ago, after having led over 30 analog missions, I was like, it's time for a change. I want to do something different and kind of go back to what I truly love, so astrobiology, but still kind of keeping my astronaut dream in parallel. And I noticed that there hasn't been much research done on the tallest mountain on each continent. So they're known as the 7 summits. Or there has been some research on individual mountains, but there hasn't been a project that kind of combined them all. So doing literally worldwide research on all 7 continents. And that's what inspired me to come up with this project, because I love going to the mountains and extreme environments to study life there. It hasn't been done before, but it's also such a challenging endeavor that I considered it to be, in a way, astronaut training. I imagine that I would gain so many more great skills from that. And also because nowadays a big part of what I do is a lot of outreach and educational work. I wanted to inspire others to also pursue their dreams and engage others in what I do. So a lot of the projects that I take on these expeditions with me are either designed by students or young people or designed for them so they can perform research at home or in their school and compare it to what I'm doing when I'm traveling around the world. So I decided to basically combine all these different passions. And in 2022, I started with my first expedition, which was to Kilimanjaro, the tallest mountain in Africa. And since then, I've led expeditions also to Aconcagua, the tallest mountain in South America, and Denali, the tallest mountain in North America. And later this year, I have Vinson, the tallest mountain in Antarctica, to look forward to. And during each of these expeditions, I collect different research samples in collaboration with NASA and different universities and institutions around the world, mostly focusing on these extremophiles, trying to understand what can survive in these extreme conditions. But I also look at climate change, like you mentioned earlier. I'm trying to see how even these extreme and very pristine environments are affected by climate change and human pollution. And I try to educate people about what we can do to have a smaller impact on the environment. Mm-hmm. And then I have different educational projects so that young people can be part of what I do. And finally, I also film documentaries during each of the expeditions so that I can make my work as approachable as possible to the public.
Okay, a lot to unpack there, but I think this is a perfect segue to a question that we got. The question is, you were referencing young people and getting them interested in astrobiology and science. The question is, how would someone in high school get into astrobiology, and what are some qualifications and research that are preferred for scientists?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, nowadays, the good news is that there are actually universities that teach astrobiology. You could enroll in a university degree program if you wanted to. When I started, astrobiology wasn't even really a thing. It was almost frowned upon, I would say, by some scientists because it was just so different, out of the box, that they kind of almost teased me about even having this ambition. So I decided to create my own path to astrobiology. I studied geology and astrophysics at University College London. When I got into Caltech, I was able to add geobiology, environmental science, microbiology to my studies. And that way I kind of myself found a way to educate myself in astrobiology. So then when I worked for NASA JPL on an astrobiology project, I had the right foundation for it. Mm-hmm. But nowadays, there are degree programs that people could aspire to. And I would also recommend figure out what part of astrobiology you're interested in, because it's such a huge science. I'm focusing on the life in extreme environments, which teaches us about the limits of life on Earth so that we could potentially find it on Mars or icy moons of Jupiter and Saturn and other places. Mm-hmm. It can also teach us about the origin of life on Earth, how life came to be here in the first place. But a different part of astrobiology, for example, looks at finding exoplanets, planets that orbit other stars. And so just looking for them requires a lot of skills, identifying them. But then nowadays, we're also looking at whether the atmospheres of these planets are indicating that there might be some molecules there that could be indicative of potentially life being there. Mm-hmm. There's a whole section of astrochemistry about how potentially some interesting biological molecules could form in space and then get attached to comets and asteroids and be transported around the universe, and that way transporting life potentially from place to place. So there's a huge variety of things you could study in astrobiology, and I recommend choose what interests you the most and then choose subjects that will help you be prepared for that. And I'll also add, the space sector is pretty competitive. So anything you can do during your high school years or even before, if you have the opportunity, is take on new projects. If you can create your own, great, or you can join different project teams at your school or maybe some national, international competitions. Anything that can show that you kind of went above and beyond just your high school studies, for example, because then when you're part of a competitive selection for a university or internship or something like that, you can stand out from the crowd by having these extra experiences and knowledge. So I guess in a nutshell, those are the main things I would recommend.
Lots of things we can do there to help prepare for those potential opportunities. Question here from Jody. Who asks, are there upper age limits for analog astronauts? And I'm curious, are there like minimum age? Do you have to like at least be an adult, or do you ever have young people?
I think that really depends on the facility. Okay. I am aware of there being some facilities in the world that I think recently had high school students as analog astronauts. And I'm hopeful that those facilities have extra supervision. And I imagine there must be some adults present make sure things are safe enough for the minors. When I ran missions at high seas, one of my criteria were that they're physically able to move around the volcanic terrain around the station, because it is actually very tricky terrain. Lava tubes can be very dangerous, but just walking on the lava is really hard. So I never had an upper age limit. It was more, as long as you're physically fit enough to do this, and on top of, being able to move around this terrain, you're wearing a heavy analog spacesuit, which restricts your breathing. Many of our EVAs, or quote unquote spacewalks, were uphill. So people will get really tired, especially at higher elevation of the 8,200 feet when going uphill with a restricted air supply. So all these things were important factors. And so I never really asked people how old they were in terms of at least the upper age limit. But I just wanted to make sure they were fit, because we didn't want anyone to get hurt. And of course, then there were all the other criteria of relevant experience and whether they worked in teams and all these sorts of things. And I would say that's more what played into the lower age limit. We didn't take on minors just for, I would say, bureaucracy reasons. But I think one of the youngest crew members I had was 19 or 20 years old. And they had all the qualifications I was looking for in terms of the skill set, experience, great, I would say, personality when it came to teamwork. They were able to be a leader and a follower, all these sorts of things that I'm particularly interested in, including that they were very empathetic too. So the fact that they were only 19 or 20 didn't make a difference to me, because they could legally join and they were just very qualified for the position.
Yeah, that's great to know. I know that MDRS recently had a crew of college students from, I believe it was the University of Texas, Austin. So they're, got to be in that 18, 19, 20, 21 range. And there is a great video out about it. Check it out online. So we know that there are young people who are pursuing their careers in analog astronaut missions. So that's pretty cool. But obviously you've been on a lot of missions, and now you're working on the Astro 7 Summits project. I imagine there's a lot of lessons or things you've learned on those analog missions that are still applicable as you're summiting these mountains in various continents. Have those missions prepared you? Are there lessons you've learned from analog missions that you're now applying while you're going on these expeditions?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the analog missions have taught me a lot about working in teams, how empathy is actually a very important thing. Being patient is vital, communicating well, and not just in terms of communicating politely, respectfully, that sort of thing, but also being able to communicate your needs as a person to the rest of your team. And that can actually be very hard for some crew members. Might be to do with their personality type or upbringing or other factors, but so many people seem to struggle with just being able to tell the rest of us, oh, I'm having a bad day today. Please just give me some space, or I need some alone time. Or on the contrary, I'm feeling really homesick or sad. Please give me a hug. It's very simple things that can make a huge difference in how someone can get through a tough time.
Yeah.
But so many people are just not able to save in those very basic things to the rest of their team. So that's something that I was trying to encourage the crew to do, and I emphasized many times from the beginning. And all those skills and the knowledge I gained, I then definitely applied during my expeditions, because in a way, it's actually very similar. It's also a small team working together under extremely difficult conditions. We can come across a lot of unexpected challenges, and so we have to think outside of the box under stress to resolve those issues. But yes, obviously the main difference is in one place we're kind of quote unquote locked inside a facility or have to wear a spacesuit to do our work. In the other, we're actually exposed to elements and roughing it in tents and things like that. But both, are extreme conditions in different ways. And in both situations, you're isolated from the rest of the world. You have to be able to communicate well with your team, have empathy, all those things. So the analog missions definitely really helped me a lot in preparing for this project. And I'm not sure I would have even come up with this project and taken it on if I didn't have all the experience I gained from the analog missions.
Yeah. Again, a skill set that you've learned that you can apply to everything else that you do in life. What are you doing to prepare for your trip to Antarctica later this year? What kind of prep goes into those type of missions?
I would say it's a combination of physical, mental, and then bureaucracy. So, from the physical point of view, it depends from expedition to expedition. But for example, for an Antarctica, I'll likely have to carry heavier loads for several days in a row. For example, recently I had the expedition to Denali, and there I had to prepare to carry between a backpack and sled about 130 pounds. So basically, myself, I had to be able to carry another one of me between the backpack and sled, and uphill, and for about 3 weeks in a row. And I essentially prepared for that expedition for about a year and a half. Luckily, the expedition in Antarctica won't be as physically challenging, so I don't have to prepare quite so much for that. But there's also things like that you wouldn't think of normally, and then suddenly like, oh yeah, I need to prepare for that too. And that's, for example, I'm going to be wearing many layers to survive in the cold temperatures in Antarctica. And so kind of like in the analog mission, suddenly you're stuck with these huge gloves, but you have to be able to kind of clip and unclip from ropes that are keeping you safe. So you have to do it really well, and you also have to do it fast because you're usually in a line with lots of people waiting, and you have to move at a certain pace. And so I just spent sometimes a few hours just training, clipping and unclipping with these humongous mittens. And I was like, oh, the analog missions kind of prepared me for this a little bit. So yeah, there's that kind of physical element of training to carry heavy things, cardio, so you can do it many days in a row. There's also a breathing component because all these mountains are at higher elevation, so there's less oxygen up there, and you essentially have to train your body to be able to function with less oxygen. So you put your body into a state of hypoxia to some degree, or hyperventilation through different exercises.
Yeah.
And so that's another thing you have to add to the mix. Then there's the mental component, which luckily through my analog missions and other experiences, I'm pretty prepared for, but I still, practice working with different people around the world, try and work on my communication skills and the way I react under certain stressful conditions. And finally, yes, there's the whole bureaucracy part. And that one is mostly about getting the permits you need to be able to do research in these different parts of the world. But most importantly, it's about funding. So I have a nonprofit here in the US called Extreme Frontiers, and one in Slovakia named after me. And I fundraise through that. So I apply for grants, I ask for sponsorships. I also have different fundraising events and websites for this. And that, I would say, is probably the hardest part of this project. Not the training and not the actual expeditions, but is being able to raise the money that I need to be able to perform these projects. So that's been pretty hard to navigate. But I'll say that in the past, unfortunately, I've had a lot of bad experiences, whether I was in academia or working in the industry where I was severely underpaid. For example, I was only paid about a third of what my male colleagues were paid, even though I was their supervisor. And I've faced a lot of other toxic environments and discrimination of all sorts. So I decided it's better for me to run my own nonprofit organizations and do this under my own terms, even though then it requires a lot of fundraising. And I think I just saw that my donation site was shared. So thank you very much. If anyone is willing and able to support, I'll greatly appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you to our producers. That was going to be my next question. Where can I go if they wanted to donate? So perfect timing, guys. I see we have a question here specifically about the expeditions. And the question is, are objectives set more by the particular missions or by the crew's expertise?
So if we're talking about the analog missions, it really depends from mission to mission, also from facility to facility, because some facilities are more about doing the psychological research, and there the crew members are in a way, quote unquote, test subjects. So they're what's being researched, and the research they're given is more in a way to keep them occupied. So they're given research that's relevant to a simulated lunar or Mars mission. They have to fill out all sorts of psychological surveys and things, but they're really just simulating being on Mars and the activities they do, while they contribute to research, they're not the primary objective of that mission. And then there's other facilities and missions which are very much focused on the individual research that the crew members are doing.
Mm-hmm.
And again, depending on the mission type and things, it's very typical for a crew member to bring their own research to the mission. So if it's, for example, a standard 2-week mission, which is, let's say, quote unquote, a standard around the world for analog missions, it's something a crew member would perform during that time. And it can be anything from some astrobiology research, research in greenhouses to see what kind of crops we could grow on Mars and the challenges they would face. It could be testing technologies like rovers and other instruments we'll need on the moon and Mars one day. So it's a whole variety of things. But then there's less of this psychological component to those missions, typically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. With those different missions, how far in advance, I'm curious, do you plan? So like you're getting ready for Antarctica this year, and obviously you're in the process of fundraising and you're, doing your manual, gloves on, hooking. So how far in advance are you planning for, you've got Europe left, I think you've got Asia still to summit. How far in advance? There we go. Yep. How far in advance do you have to plan those expeditions?
That also depends on how challenging the mountain is and how challenging it is to fundraise for it. So, for example, the expedition to Antarctica this year is the most financially challenging expedition to plan for. So that one I've planned 3 years ago, and I've been just working up to it all this time. The other missions or expeditions were luckily less expensive, so I didn't have to allocate quite as much time to fundraise for them. But in general, I plan at least a year in advance. And then depending on the challenges of the bureaucracy, or for example, with Denali, I knew it was going to be extremely physically challenging. So I gave myself at least a year and a half to train for it. So it really depends on how difficult it is to be able to perform that expedition. And then sometimes there's surprises that happen where for some expeditions, it's fairly straightforward to get a permit. For example, for Denali, it only took me maybe 3 months to get the permits that I needed. But other mountains require over a year to get permits, if not longer. And that may also cause me to kind of reshuffle my plans to deal with that. But in general, for everything, I plan at least a year, and then I adjust things depending on how things are evolving.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that there's a documentary element to this. Are we going to be able to see this at some point? What does that look like?
Yeah, so the first documentary already came out. It's called Hakuna Matata Kilimanjaro. And you might be familiar with Hakuna Matata from The Lion King. It kind of means like, take it easy, no worries. And that was mostly to highlight the wonderful attitude the local people in Tanzania, where Kilimanjaro is located, what their attitude is like. They face so many difficulties on a daily basis, and yet they're still able to be very kind and happy and find the positive side of life at all times. So that documentary, in a way, was very much kind of a tribute to them and also highlighted them during the documentary. And it came out last year, and I've only shown it in a few places. I even had a small premiere here in DC last year and Pittsburgh earlier this year. And I'm trying to find a way to best showcase it. So I'm open to suggestions if anyone has any ideas about film festivals. But eventually I want to put it on YouTube so it's accessible to everyone, and it will be on my website and my social media.
Okay. Well, those that have suggestions, put those in the comments as well. Where should she be releasing that? I have to ask, I mean, you're doing so much. I imagine this is demanding work. So how do you balance research, mission work, public engagement, educating the public? How do you do all of this while maintaining, some sanity, your well-being?
It's definitely very hard, and it's been something I've been trying to figure out how to balance my whole life. It definitely takes up a lot of time, and that's actually kind of the answer to your very first question about why I'm only doing singing now, because it took me 35 years to find a much better balance in my life. And now I just know it's so important to prioritize time for yourself, to spend time on your hobbies, family, and friends. Because when you're in a better place physically and emotionally, it makes it so much easier to do all the other work that you're so passionate about.
Mhm.
So it just took me time to realize that. Before, I thought I had to just work really hard all the time to achieve things, which I did, but then I was always on the verge of burnout. And then it was easier for me to be taken advantage of, unfortunately, in those toxic environments that I mentioned. And now taking better care of myself has also made me value myself better. And that way I can manage things better, essentially on my own for my nonprofits.
Mhm. I see we already have our first suggestion for where we should show your movie, and that is at the Mars Society conference
That's a very good idea.
next month, August 8th through the 11th, is when we'll be hosting that. Well, Michaela, it has been such a pleasure to chat with you today. We covered the whole gambit, all the topics, but I know there are some questions I had prepared that we didn't get to. We just are at our time, and I'm so grateful and thankful for your time today and joining me and coming on the podcast and asking or answering the many questions that we've thrown your way.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much. And if there are any questions that didn't get answered, feel free to reach out to me through social media. You can find me most places under astro_Michaela or Facebook page, Dr. Michaela Musilova. Or I'm sure if you Google me or my website, you'll find them. And I'm happy to answer your questions even after this podcast.
Well, thank you so much for that. I'm sure you're going to get some questions. And before we wrap up the conversation, just want to say again, thank you, Michaela, for being here. Thank you to the Liftport team. Thank you to the Mars Society. I'm going to close out the show the way we always do. And that is remember,